Imagine a dirt road just outside Florence, moonless, silence heavy as wool. A young couple squeezes into the back of a small car, the engine idling, soft laughter, a cigarette passed between them, then a single, clean gunshot that rips the night open. The man never wakes. The woman lies mutilated, her body rearranged like a message. That scene, repeated in different places over nearly 2 decades, is the heart of what Italy calls Il Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence. Today, we try to sit with that pattern and the long list of questions it left behind.
It's chilling, Elena. The rural roads around Florence became something else entirely in those years. No longer just scenic, but dangerous. Intimate spaces turned into crime scenes.
By the way, Lorenzo, tell the listeners briefly how many people we're talking about and what the pattern looked like.
Between 1968 and 1985, there were at least 16 victims in 8 double homicides. Mostly young couples parked in secluded spots, lovers' lanes, killed at night, often near a new moon. The killer used a .22 caliber Beretta with Winchester H bullets, shots usually followed by stabbing and the repeated post-mortem mutilation of female victims. It's a distinct and disturbing pattern.
Right, and that 1968 killing, Signa, is often called Case Zero. A woman named Barbara Locci and a man, Antonio Lobianco, were found shot in their car. It's worth noting that Locci's 6-year-old son woke up, found his mother dead, and ran to a house nearby. That detail, little Natalino Mele waking to trauma, haunted the local memory. People, understandably, remember that.
But we should be careful. Early on, police treated Signa as a more domestic crime. Locci's husband, Stefano Mele, was arrested and convicted for her murder, and he gave shifting statements that dragged in several of her Sardinian lovers. That messy trail fed what became the Sardinian Trail, a line of inquiry that dominated early investigations.
So the killings don't solidify as a serial pattern until later. The first clear signal comes with the 1974 Borgo San Lorenzo murders, Stefania Pettini and Pasquale Gentlecore, where the woman was mutilated. That began a grim signature. Then the pattern becomes unmistakable in the 1980s, especially with the Scandicci killings in June 1981. Same gun, same bullets. Ballistics finally tie cases together. That's when the word for it, serial killer, starts to enter Italian policing.
And that was challenging. Italy in the 1970s and 80s hadn't built the sort of serial killer investigative culture that the US had started to develop. The country was already under the shadow of political violence, the years of lead. So a methodical predator preying on couples in the countryside was a different kind of terror. Police were learning the vocabulary and the tools as the crimes kept happening.
Let's walk through the chronology, because the sequence matters. After 1968 and 1974 came 1981, Scandicci in June, then Calenzano in October the same year. By 1982, we have the Bacchiano attack, where Carlo Mainardi survives the immediate attack, is treated as a crash victim, and dies hours later in hospital. Police delayed securing that scene and failed to properly interview a surviving victim. That missed opportunity became emblematic of investigative mistakes. Lorenzo, how huge was that misstep?
It was critical. Survivors, witnesses, any living person who could provide contemporaneous detail are often the difference between investigative leads and dead ends. Treating the scene as a crash, not a homicide, squandered the chance to get Mainardi's account. In a case that would turn on small forensic and testimonial threads, that was a severe loss.
There's also the odd deviation in 1983 Giogoli, where two German tourists, Horst Meyer and Jens Uwe Rusch, both men, were shot and stabbed in their tent. No mutilation of female genitals there, which suggests the mutilation was a targeted act against women, not just random post-mortem violence. It's an important detail.
Yes, the lack of mutilation in that instance underlines that the sexualized violence was specific. The killer or killers had a particular focus on female bodies. That pattern helps shape offender profiles. Someone with sexual sadism and a ritualized component, perhaps taking souvenirs, body parts in some accounts.
And the last confirmed killing is 8 September 1985 in Skopje. French tourists Nadine Mario and Jean-Michel Kravitchvili. The murder is brutal, the woman mutilated. Weeks later, another thread involving a doctor, Francesco Narducci, vanishes and turns into its own strange subplot. We'll come back to that. But after 1985, the murders stop, at least as far as definitively attributable cases go.
That stoppage deepened the mystery. Did the killer die, leave the region, or simply stop? Or was there more than one offender and the others were incarcerated for unrelated crimes? The silence after 1985 is itself a clue or a taunt.
Let's move into the investigation itself, because that's where the story gets messier. Early police attention gravitated to Sardinian suspects connected to the 1968 case. Stefano Mele's accusations pointed to a network of Sardinian men. But by 1989, all remaining Sardinian suspects were cleared. That early fixation exposed ethnic stereotyping and an eagerness for neat answers. Lorenzo?
Exactly. The Sardinian trail began largely because of Mele's shifting testimony and the presence of Sardinian migrant communities near Florence. It was a narrative convenience. It gave investigators names and motives. But when new murders with the identical gun and pattern occurred while those suspects were in custody or monitored, it undermined the theory. That phase became a cautionary example of investigative bias, chasing plausible suspects rather than following the forensic thread.
Which brings us to the man who became the public face of the case, Pietro Pacciani, the farmer from Mercatale. The prosecution portrayed him as the archetypal monstrous peasant with a violent past. A 1951 homicide with overkill, a history of domestic abuse, even incest convictions. There were items in his home and a single bullet allegedly found in his garden. Prosecutors linked symbolic elements from his past crimes to the monstrous sexualized mutilations. But critics argue the evidence was planted, manipulated, and circumstantial at best.
The Pacciani phase is emblematic of the case's complexity. On the one hand, his criminal history and familiarity with the countryside made him a plausible suspect. The computer analysis that flagged him tied geography, age, and prior violence. On the other hand, there was no definitive forensic link. No murder weapon, no DNA tying him to the crime scenes. The bullet found in his garden remains contentious. Some investigators later admitted the search procedures were sloppy enough that contamination, or planting, could have happened.
He was convicted in 1994, sentenced to multiple life terms, then acquitted on appeal in 1996 when the Attorney General himself asked for acquittal, saying the evidence was weak. Then the Supreme Court ordered a retrial, but Pacciani died in 1998 before it began. Some people whisper about suicide or foul play, but officially it was a heart attack. It's haunting. An unresolved death wrapped into a still unresolved case.
His death effectively closed a chapter without resolving the central question: was he the monster or a scapegoat? For many investigators and family members, that ambiguity has never been acceptable. It's one reason the case continues to attract scrutiny and outrage.
Then there's the bizarre phrase, the snack buddies, Vanni and Lottie. Mario Vanni, a postman and friend of Pacciani, and Giancarlo Lottie, vulnerable and suggestible, became central in later prosecutions. Lottie at times confessed, then recanted, then offered shifting stories where he described Pacciani and Vanni killing and mutilating while he watched. The prosecutions relied heavily on his statements. Critics call those confessions coerced or contaminated. It's ugly.
Yes, in court, the term compagni di merende, snack buddies, became an almost mocking shorthand for their relationship. But the core issue is evidentiary. Convictions rested largely on Lotti's testimony and the narrative the prosecution built, not on solid physical proof. Journalists like Mario Spezzi and Douglas Preston have argued this was a shaky construct. Three aging, unsophisticated men carrying out a long, stealthy series of murders and evading modern forensics strains plausibility.
And yet, in 1998, Vanni got life and Lottie decades in prison. Appeals upheld those convictions despite ongoing criticism. So the legal record ends up being a tanglesome. Some men convicted, others acquitted, many thinking the true monster was never identified. Lorenzo, do you think the convictions satisfy a legal threshold, or were they a product of pressure to close a terrifying case?
It's complicated. Courts at times have to make judgments based on the evidence presented in that moment. But this case shows how public fear and institutional pressure can shape prosecutorial choices. When the community demands answers and the media demands narratives, there's a risk the justice system leans into what appears convincing rather than what is conclusively proven. From a forensic perspective, without the gun or uncontaminated DNA linking those men to the full series, reasonable doubt persists for many observers.
Now, we can't avoid the more sensational theories, the satanic cult and secret society allegations. That's been a controversial thread, led by figures like Michele Giuttari and prosecutor Giuliano Minghini. They argued Pacciani and his circle were not lone killers, but contract murderers serving an elite cabal, possibly obtaining female body parts for ritual purposes. Gabriella Carlizzi and others fed the narrative in the media. It's a lot.
The satanic theory dovetails with a broader moral panic of the 1980s and 90s. Satanic panic was a global phenomenon. Proponents pointed to supposed payment for body parts, the presence of symbolic stones near villas, and anecdotal suggestions that a doctor had procured bodies. However, many legal scholars and journalists dismissed this as conspiratorial thinking that diverted resources. The supposedly occult evidence was often ordinary rural detritus reinterpreted as sinister.
Part of that theory reached into high society. The name of Dr. Francesco Narducci, who disappeared in 1985 and later turned up drowned in Lake Trasimeno, became entangled in allegations of a cover-up and of elite involvement. Some investigators pushed for exhumations and suggested inconsistencies in his autopsy, but mainstream opinion remains skeptical. Trials failed to produce proof, and at least one pharmacist, Francesco Calamandrei, was acquitted in 2008. It's a good example of how a case can spin into myth.
Exactly. Conspiracy theories can gain traction when there are institutional gaps, missing evidence, botched scenes, and high public fear. They offer an explanation that seems to fit the horror of the crimes, even if the evidence isn't there. That makes them compelling but dangerous to victims' families, to accused individuals, and to the integrity of investigations.
Another eyebrow-raising hypothesis, a link to the Zodiac killer. Journalist Francesco Amicone proposed that Joseph Bevilacqua, a man alleged to have been a U.S. serviceman stationed in Italy, was both the Zodiac in California and the monster in Tuscany. Amicone claims Bevilacqua could have moved between the two scenes and that the man later had access to Italy in 1968. The theory got legally rebuked.
Amicone's theory drew attention, but in December 2024, a Florence court convicted him of defamation against Bevilacqua's family, calling his hypothesis unsubstantiated. It's an example of how cross-Atlantic conspiracy links can make for sensational journalism, but they don't equate to prosecutable evidence. The Zodiac monster link remains speculative and legally challenged.
We should also mention for listeners that journalists continued exploring claims about Bevilacqua after his death. Some podcasts suggested he confessed on his deathbed, but none of that has been confirmed by authorities. So again, speculation without judicial closure.
Right. And speculation matters because it can distract from more mundane but plausible leads. Local men with access to firearms and secluded land who never received full scrutiny. Some names periodically resurface in investigative journalism as people who didn't get a fair look under earlier flawed inquiries.
Okay, turning to forensics, the technical side. Early crime scenes were often poorly preserved. Bullets and casings were contaminated, record-keeping inconsistent, and DNA wasn't a tool in regular use until the late 1980s. The .22 Beretta itself was never recovered. That absence and the era's forensic limitations left a vacuum, compensated by narrative and guesswork. Lorenzo, explain how those forensic shortcomings shaped the long arc of this case.
When you don't have key physical evidence, no murder weapon, no pristine DNA, investigators rely more on circumstantial links, ballistics patterning when possible, geographic profiling, witness statements. But the lack of standardized evidence handling in the 1970s means that what could have been testable decades later often became unusable. Contaminated bullets, mishandled clothing, and interrupted crime scenes reduced the chance that modern DNA techniques would be able to deliver definitive matches. That, in turn, allowed competing narratives to flourish.
And yet, in recent years, there's been some renewed forensic work. Reports say DNA traces from 3 different crime scenes and from anonymous letters have been profiled and do not match known suspects, including Pacciani, Vanni, and Lottie. That suggests the convicted men may not have been the principal offenders, but authorities have been hesitant to officially reopen or reframe the case. Lorenzo, how should listeners read that? Is modern DNA finally giving us answers, or just more questions?
It's more of the latter, at least for now. The fact that DNA profiles from evidence and letters don't match the known convicted individuals weakens the case that those men were the sole perpetrators. But it doesn't automatically identify an alternative perpetrator. DNA can exclude, not always point conclusively, especially when profiles are partial or when the DNA belongs to an unknown third party. Unless those profiles match someone in a database, or unless investigators have the political will to aggressively compare samples against a wide population, the results remain tantalizing but inconclusive.
There's this image of letters coming into prosecutors' offices, sometimes with pieces of flesh allegedly from victims. Disturbing. Those letters shaped profiles of someone who took souvenirs, who wanted recognition or control. But were those letters ever proven to be from the killer? Lorenzo?
Those communications are always tricky. Pseudo-confessional letters and claimed souvenirs can be from attention seekers, hoaxers, or indeed the perpetrator. Unless you have incontrovertible forensic linkage, you can't assume authenticity. In this case, the letters informed psychological profiles. Someone with sexual sadism, comfortable with the countryside, possibly seeking to taunt authorities. But attribution remains contested without solid proof.
Let's pause. I want listeners to feel the human cost here. Every time we talk about patterns and theories, we're talking about real couples, teenagers and young adults whose families had to live with this trauma, sometimes in public debates. Some families want the case reopened, others fear endless rehashing. There's a moral question about closure, too. What does closure even mean when certainty is impossible? Lorenzo.
Closure is a complicated, often inadequate word. For many families, a conviction satisfies a need for accountability, even if doubts remain. For others, the idea that the wrong men were convicted or that the killer remains unidentified means closure is a mirage. There's also the harm of public spectacle. Their grief was transformed into headlines and novels, and that can feel like a second violation.
And then the wider cultural impact. This case changed behavior in Tuscany. Couples avoided nighttime drives into the hills. There were moralizing voices calling the murders a punishment for premarital sex. The press sensationalized mutilations and satanic rumors. Suspects were caricatured. It even influenced fiction. Thomas Harris drew on the case in Hannibal. The Monster of Florence entered Italian and international popular culture as more than a criminal case. It became a mythic object of fear. That myth-making matters.
It does. When a case becomes a cultural symbol, the truth can be reshaped to fit the symbol. Sensational narratives sell papers and attention, but they also shape investigative priorities. Investigators can become defenders of a particular story they've told the public, which then discourages rethinking when new evidence suggests different directions.
Which takes us to the core questions that make this still unanswered.
I want to run through them. And please, Lorenzo, jump in. First, is the monster one person, several people, or a coordinated group?
The evidence could be read either way. The consistent use of the same weapon type and the recurring mutilation suggest a single offender with a ritualized signature. But changes over the 17 years, differences in timing, location, and that odd double male German killing open the door to multiple perpetrators or copycats. The possibility that more than one person shared the gun also complicates the picture. Without a single traceable signature link to a single human hand, we can't be definitive.
Second, did Italy convict the wrong men? If Pacciani, Vanni, and Lottie were innocent or only marginally involved, who benefits from those convictions? What does that say about institutional pressure?
Convicting the wrong people benefits no one morally, but politically it can provide a sense of closure for a terrified public and for institutions under scrutiny. It signals that authorities are acting decisively. But that can come at the cost of truth. If circumstantial evidence and pressured confessions are elevated above rigor. The Monster case shows how institutional defensiveness can harden into a protective narrative that resists correction.
Third, why did the killings stop in 1985? Did the killer die or relocate? Is there any credible link between the final Scopetti murder and the 1985 death of Dr. Narducci?
We don't have a credible forensic link established in the public record that proves Narducci's connection. The timing invites speculation, but correlation isn't causation. The killer's cessation could be explained by death, imprisonment for another reason, relocation, or even a conscious decision to stop. Each hypothesis has unknowns. None are decisively supported by the evidence we have.
Fourth, what role did media and myth-making play? We've touched on this, but it's key. Did sensationalism distort the investigation? Did the satanic narratives distract from prosaic explanations?
Sensationalism amplified the most lurid interpretations. That can divert resources into chasing conspiracies and stigmatizing suspects rather than rigorous, methodical re-examination. The satanic theory is a clear example. It consumed attention and produced allegations of elite complicity that were never substantiated in court.
Fifth, can modern forensics finally answer what 1970s-80s investigators could not? What would a true, independent cold case review look like?
A credible cold case review would begin with a forensically sound inventory of all preserved evidence, unbiased re-examination using current DNA methods, and transparent sharing of results with defense counsel and independent experts. It would also examine investigative procedures for contamination and misconduct. If usable samples exist and profiles can be matched to living individuals or genealogically linked, the case could move forward. But that requires political will, funding, and institutional humility.
And finally, what does this case tell us about how societies handle fear? Are we more comfortable believing in a single monstrous figure than admitting systemic failure?
Often, yes. A single monstrous person is a tidy villain. Systemic failure is messy and implicates institutions we rely on. The Monster of Florence offered the narrative the public could focus hate on. But that narrative can occlude deeper questions about policing, social prejudice, and media dynamics. Those are harder to confront, but they're essential if we want to prevent future injustices.
As we wind toward the end, I want to read a short moment from Douglas Preston and Mario Spezzi's criticism, just to reflect the skepticism. They argued the investigations became invested in defending a narrative even when evidence eroded, leading to institutional defensiveness rather than openness to new leads. That sentiment echoes through much of what we've said today.
And it echoes in the DNA developments you mentioned. Profiles from letters and scenes not matching convicted individuals. Those exclusions are critical. They force us to ask whether the convictions answer the public's need for action while leaving the forensic questions unresolved. If modern profiles point away from the convicted, then the moral imperative is to be transparent about that and, where appropriate, reopen inquiries.
Before we close, Lorenzo, something personal. You've consulted on cold cases. You've seen the toll on families and on investigators. When you approach a case like this, where myth, media, and messy evidence intertwine, what keeps you honest as a forensic criminologist?
Humility and method. Humility about how much we can know, and rigorous method in how we test hypotheses. That means resisting narratives that feel satisfying but aren't supported by evidence. And it means protecting evidence and witnesses so future techniques, sometimes decades later, can be brought to bear. It also means listening to victims' families with empathy, recognizing that truth and closure aren't identical, but both are important.
Thank you. The Monster of Florence case sits at a painful intersection. Horrific crimes, flawed investigations, cultural myth-making, and decades of unanswered questions. We've tried to trace the outline of the murders, the missteps, the trials, the theories, and the new forensic glimmers that tell us this story isn't over. It may never be neatly resolved, but the work of re-examination matters, not just for history, but for justice.
One last note. For listeners who want to learn more, read the investigative books, but read them with a critical eye. Understand where journalists may be advocating a theory versus where courts have ruled. And remember that in this case, as in many others, certainty is often an illusion.
Yeah, and be careful with late-night drives into the hills. No, I'm kidding. Kind of. Lorenzo, any final thoughts?
Only this. Keep asking questions. The monsters we create in stories sometimes hide the failures we need to fix. If we interrogate those failures, we honor the victims more than any tidy narrative ever could.
Thank you, Lorenzo. And thank you, listeners, for sitting with this with us. If you want sources and a reading list, we'll link the main materials we used today in the episode notes. Wikipedia's Monster of Florence entry, Encyclopedia Britannica overviews, the reporting in People and Biography that covered the Netflix series and the modern DNA developments, and Douglas Preston and Mario Spezzi's book. We relied on those materials for today's reconstruction. This is still unanswered. I'm Elena Marquez. Lorenzo Bianchi, thank you for joining.
Thanks, Elena. Take care.
Sources referenced in this episode: Wikipedia, Monster of Florence; Encyclopedia Britannica, biographical overviews and analysis; reporting from People and Biography on the Netflix series and recent DNA work; The Guardian coverage on the cultural and satanic allegations; Douglas Preston and Mario Spezzi, The Monster of Florence, A True Story.
We'll list full links in the show notes. Good night.